these efforts. But my greater concern, and the one that I would hope that members would look at, is this anti-free speech movement that Antifa is part of. I've been teaching for 30 years. I have never seen the level of fear and intimidation on campuses that we see today. Faculty are afraid to speak out about issues. We can't have a dialogue about the important issues occurring today because there's a fear that you might be accused of being reactionary or racist. We've had law professors who've been physically attacked, have required police protection. That's the environment that we're developing. And for people that think that Antifa and groups like it can be allies, they don't know Antifa. And those of us who've been teaching on campuses can tell you about these groups. And the alarm that I have is because I'm watching my profession, the teaching profession, die with free speech. Administrators are not protecting academic freedom. Why should they protect free speech? We're seeing that many of these speakers are being prevented from speaking on campus under various theories. And the message is clear to faculty, it's clear to students. There's a new orthodoxy that you should not confront and you certainly shouldn't disagree with. And I go through those details in my testimony.
So, Professor Turley, I very much agree with you that we ought to be united in condemning violence from whatever ideological origin it comes from, whether right wing, left wing, or no wing at all. If you're committing violence against fellow Americans, that ought to be condemned. You ought to be arrested. You ought to be prosecuted. You ought to go to jail. I do think it is striking that in the entire course of this hearing, 7 Democratic senators spoke in this hearing. Not a single Democratic senator condemned Antifa. Not a one of them condemned Antifa's violence and terrorism. Do you think it is harmful? The sitting Attorney General of Minnesota, a Democrat, posed with the book you just held up in your testimony, the Antifa Handbook, gleefully modeling it. Do you think it is helpful for elected Democrats to be holding out a violent anti-speech organization like Antifa and acting essentially as apologists for it? Is that good for our democracy?
You know, I criticized Mr. Ellison for that tweet. There are some Democratic politicians that have not only failed to denounce Antifa, but have actually, in that case, seemed to give it a shout-out. In that case, Mr. Ellison said that they would put the fear in the heart of Donald Trump. But what he doesn't see is that Antifa is putting the fear in the hearts of many people other than Donald Trump. If you go to campuses today, you will find more advocates for limiting speech than protecting it. They're winning. And when you see pictures like Mr. Ellison's picture with Antifa, it's very disturbing because Antifa is not coming after him. They're not even coming after Democrats. They're coming after Republicans, conservatives, and those of us in the free speech community. They're coming after us. But don't think we'll be the last ones. That's not how this works.
And I will also note that I'm Cuban American and white supremacists hate me too. But at the same time, it's fairly striking that elected Democrats want to ignore the violence of Antifa. They want to ignore the violence on the left, and they just scream white supremacists, rather than condemn violence from wherever it is coming. The 277 injuries of federal law enforcement officers in Portland are coming from the left, and not a single Democrat on this committee acknowledges that. David Dorn, African-American police officer, was murdered. Retired police officer in St. Louis, who is black, was murdered. Not a single one of the 7 Democratic senators who spoke at this hearing mentioned David Dorn's name. Patrick Underwood, another officer. Senator Durbin was the one Democrat who mentioned Patrick Underwood's name. Another black officer murdered. We see Democrats who repeat the slogan, Black Lives Matter, but apparently those black lives are not worth discussing. The black lives of police officers murdered by terrorists. I would note as well, when it comes to Black Lives Matter, as a proposition, the statement Black Lives Matter is unquestionably true. It is a truism, it is indisputable, period, full stop. Black lives matter and matter enormously. Every human being is a precious gift from God. That being said, and quite rightly, the overwhelming majority of Americans agree with the proposition Black Lives Matter. It should be 100% of Americans agree with the proposition Black Lives Matter. That is different, I would note, than the specific organization that has taken up the name Black Lives Matter. And I think it is important to draw a distinction between the statement Black Lives Matter, that is indisputably right, and the organization that it denominated Black Lives Matter. That organization was founded in 2013. It was founded by 3 self-described radical Marxists. The 3 founders of it were Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, and Patrisse Khan-Cullors. And some of the facts behind this organization, Black Lives Matter, are important for people to know. Cullors said she and Garza, this is her words, are, quote, trained Marxists. And she said, quote, I read, I study, adding Mao, Marx, and Lenin to my knowledge of books. Mao, Marx, and Lenin, or Mao and Lenin, rather, murdered millions, were among the worst tyrants humanity has ever known. The Black Lives Matter group, their founders, have explicitly praised Marxist Angela Davis. Now, who is Angela Davis? They said she's a mentor. Angela Davis was the Communist Party vice presidential nominee in 1980 and 1984. She's explicitly a communist. She was affiliated with the Black Panther Party. Cullors, one of the 3 founders of the Black Lives Matter organization, said, quote, Angela Davis is a mentor of mine. Not only that, the founders have praised domestic terrorist Assata Shakur. Now, who is that? Assata Shakur is a convicted cop killer, murdered a police officer. She is right now today on the FBI's most wanted list and is likely a fugitive in Cuba. And by the way, it isn't just a passing praise. Ms. Cullors wrote a memoir, When They Call You a Terrorist, a Black Lives Matter memoir that included a foreword written by communist Angela Davis. And by the way, it's not me calling her a communist. She was the vice presidential nominee of the Communist Party. She is explicitly a communist. And an opening epigraph from Shakur, the cop killer on the FBI's most wanted list. Not only that, in terms of funding, the organization BLM is financially sponsored by the Thousand Currents, an organization vice-chaired by Susan Rosenberg. Who's Rosenberg? A member of the leftist violent terrorist organization, the May 19th Communist Organization, involved in multiple politically motivated bombings. Now, what does the organization Black Lives Matter support? When you go to the website, they tell you, they're not hiding it. Their top priority is defunding the police across the United States of America. It's not defending equal justice for everyone. That everyone supports. It is abolishing and defunding police departments in every community in this country. Not only that, the group BLM has a long record of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel attacks, including arguing that Israel is a, quote, apartheid state that is committing genocide. And by the way, the BLM founders who revere Angela Davis's record, profoundly anti-Semitic and anti-Israel. Indeed, she was asked, would she be willing to speak up on behalf of Jewish prisoners of conscience in the Soviet Union? She was a big apologist for the Soviet Union, and she responded when she visited Moscow. So she's meeting with the Soviet leaders in Moscow, and her response was, instead of speaking up for the Jewish prisoners of conscience, she would urge that they be kept in prison because, quote, they are all Zionist, fascist, and opponents of socialism. What else does BLM, the organization, support? On its website, it is called for a, quote, boycott of white capitalism. In 2017, they called on people not to spend any money with white corporations. And not only that, the BLM website says that one of their objective is dismantling the, quote, patriarchal practices and disrupting the Western prescribed nuclear family. That's what they say their objectives are. Now, the reason that matters is right now corporate America is desperate to demonstrate their virtue as we see great racial dissension. So Black Lives Matter, BLM, the group, raises money on Act Blue, the fundraising mechanism for virtually every elected Democrat in Congress. Among the donors to BLM, the organization, according to public reports, include the company Ubisoft, which has given between $50,000 and $100,000, DoorDash, which has given reportedly $500,000, Amazon, which has given an unidentified portion of $10 million, Gatorade, which has given an unidentified portion of $500,000, Nabisco, which has given an unidentified portion of $500,000, Deckers, which has given an unidentified portion of $500,000, Microsoft, which has given $250,000, Dropbox, which has given $500,000, and Fitbit, which the amount given is not identified. I would note Microsoft, the largest individual shareholder, is Bill Gates. It's more than ironic that Microsoft is funding an organization calling for boycotting all white corporations. Bill Gates is white. Microsoft is literally funding an organization calling for Microsoft to be defunded. Jeff Bezos, the largest owner of Amazon, who likewise is funding this radical Marxist group. Jeff Bezos is white too, and he's funding an organization that is calling for the boycotting of Amazon. This is dangerous, and it's worth understanding that when corporate America floods millions of dollars into explicitly Marxist terrorist organizations that glorify cop killers, that glorify violence, that the violence and terrorism that flows from that should not be surprising. Without objection, I'm going to enter into the record an article from the Washington Examiner dated July 23, 2020, the title of which is, "Who is Black Lives Matter?" And I would encourage anyone who wants to understand who this organization is to read this article. On the proposition as a value proposition, do Black Lives Matter? Absolutely yes. And our nation was founded on the proposition that all men are created equal, regardless of race or skin color. But the organization that has seized that name is very different, and if they succeeded with their stated #1 objective of defunding and abolishing every police department, many, many more black lives would be lost because more African Americans would be murdered without the police officers that bravely risked their lives to defend those communities. Well, I appreciate the, as always, kind and uplifting words of Senator Hirono. And I would also note that throughout her remarks, she still did not say a negative word about Antifa, nor has any Democrat here. They instead engage in a political game where they depend. You're welcome to say something negative about Antifa right now.
I think that I've covered the subject quite well. You are not listening.
Okay, she declined to speak, so that is the position of the Democratic Party. I would note also that of the 7 Democratic senators who spoke, not a one of them apologized for or denounced multiple Democrats calling law enforcement officers Nazis, stormtroopers and Gestapo, to be fair. I have not heard the word Nazi, but stormtrooper was Nancy Pelosi and Gestapo was another Democratic leader. That is less than helpful. I thank each of the witnesses for your testimony. I thank you for defending free speech. And I thank you for speaking out against violence and against terrorism. The record in this hearing will be held open for 1 week. Senators may follow up with the witnesses of either this panel or the previous panel with written questions. If you receive written questions, you are asked to submit the answers to those questions by the close of business 1 week from today. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.